Hi, everyone. I'm going to have a little tech issue, so 1 second there. Panel for the Institute for Science and Policy's annual symposium, where we're talking about the future of science policy. Thank you all for being patient with me. I'm Chris Muhlenbrock. I'm the executive director of the Institute. If you've been with us throughout the day, you may have seen that I've had a few technology issues, which I had been hoping that our very first panel of technology experts would have helped me solve, but we didn't get the answer yet that we needed today. But hopefully you've enjoyed today's programs if you've joined in for our previous panels, and I am thrilled and excited to close out our symposium with an even really thoughtful panel that I think many of us think about and spend a lot of time on, which is about the future of climate science and climate policy. We have a really amazing lineup of guests. Before I introduce them, I just want to offer that if you have questions or thoughts or comments throughout the panel, you're welcome to drop them into the chat. We'll keep our eyes on those questions throughout the session today, and we'll kind of filter those into the conversation as they fit in. But definitely please engage us in the chat throughout today's session. So we have 4 great guests joining us. We have Kate Marvel, who is a research scientist at NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, also affiliated with Columbia University. She recently served as a senior climate scientist at Project Drawdown. Dr. Marvel's research has centered on climate modeling for better prediction of Earth's temperatures and how it will rise in the future. You may have seen her in many TED Talks and many public engagement opportunities. I've seen her in books and whatnot. She's a great public speaker. And Kate, I saw you even have a new book coming out soon called Human Nature, 9 Ways to Feel About Our Changing Planet. Looks like that's coming out next year. Thanks for being here today. It's nice to have you.
Thank you for having me. Yeah.
We also have Unruh Cohen. Anna is the Senior Director for NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Infrastructure and Clean Energy at the White House Council on Environmental Quality under the Biden administration. She has spent more than 2 decades in Washington, D.C., working on U.S. federal climate and energy policy. And she previously had been serving as the Majority Staff Director for the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. And just recently, she was chosen as Time's inaugural list of 100 most influential climate leaders in business. Anna, it's great to have you today as well. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Fabulous. And then a dear friend of ours and close ally just right up the street here, in person we've worked with before, is the lovely Leif van Boven, who is a professor and chair of the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of Colorado Boulder. He directs the Environment, Decision, Judgment, and Identity Lab and is the co-director of the Center for Creative Climate Communication and Behavior Change. His research really integrates social, environmental, and political psychology. He has an amazing number of publications, and I'm often looking to his research to learn a lot more about the work that I do. Leif, it's lovely to have you join us for something again. Thanks for being here today.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Fabulous. And our lovely host and moderator is actually one of the Institute's Strategic Council members. She's been with the Institute since our beginning. It is Dahvi Wilson. Dahvi is the founder and president of Siting Clean, where she currently co-leads an initiative called Siting Clean Collaborative, where they're trying to help advise and connect members from the nonprofit, academic, philanthropic, and renewable industry energy sectors together to work on local siting and permitting challenges in order to develop more clean renewable energy projects. Previously, Dahvi was the vice president for public affairs for Apex Clean Energy. Dahvi, thank you for being here today and for leading our conversation. I know it's going to be fruitful. I'm going to pass this over to you in your very competent hands and look forward to listening.
Thank you. Thanks, Kristen. Yeah, really excited to be here, being a part of this symposium and closing you all out today. So as you heard, we've got some really excellent speakers, and we want to talk today about the future of climate policy and how science should be influencing that or might be influencing that in the future. So, we've all spent the last several weeks, I think, thinking about what these election outcomes that we just had are going to mean for climate work. And we thought we might just start there a little bit and get the elephant out in the room here. But asking the panel, are there any big ideas for climate policy that are feeling more promising or more hopeful based on what's changed and what we're seeing now? And if you don't mind sharing your idea of some of the opportunities in front of us, as well as why you think we might be in a good position to advance those ideas in the future. And maybe, Anna, we could start with you on this one.
Sure. Thanks, Dahvi. It's great to be here with everybody. From my perspective, there's two things to hit on here. First, we really are at the early stages of the impact of the historic investments that we've been able to make as part of President Biden's Investing in America agenda through the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. And we're really just seeing the beginning of the wave of clean energy manufacturing that's attracted hundreds of billions of dollars into private sector investment and is already starting to create clean energy jobs and help lower costs for families. That boom is already helping to lower costs for clean energy technology as much as 25%, which, I think we'll continue to see that pay dividends into the future. The Biden administration has really taken a government-enabled but private sector-led approach, and that's worked. Companies have announced more than $450 billion in new clean energy investments. And so I think that gives me some confidence in the durability of this work in the interest of it going forward. And in addition to that private investment that we've attracted, there's also almost $100 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act that have gone into projects across the country that are going to help communities figure out their climate solutions for the impacts and their needs. And so, I think of it as sort of throwing a big rock into a pond, and ripples have just started, and we're going to see, sort of how far those go. The other piece that this administration has really been focused on, and is what I've came to the administration to do and been working on for the better part of the last 2 years, is really to help make environmental review and permitting more effective and efficient so we can build the clean energy infrastructure that we need. And part of that was investment. In the Inflation Reduction Act, we had $1 billion that has gone to hiring staff and building out technology to do those reviews. And then here at CEQ, we also have been working to modernize our regulations for the National Environmental Policy Act following the amendments that happened to the Act in 2023. Both the focus of this administration on permitting, as well as these additional tools that have started to come on, has mean that we're already seeing environmental impact statement review times come down by 6 months compared to the last administration. And so I'll just wrap up there, because I know probably many folks in the audience have heard about conversations about permitting reform and potentially more legislation, which may come. We'll see what Congress does here in the last of the year. But I do really want to emphasize, in order to build the clean energy infrastructure that we need, and I know, Dahvi, you're deep in this place, you actually really need governments of all levels to prioritize it, to provide the capacity to get those projects reviewed and built, and most importantly, in a way that communities are accepting of, or even better, embracing, which is our goal.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Yeah, and, just as you were referring to, the work that I'm doing right now is really focused on local and mostly local governments that are making critical decisions about utility scale, clean energy siting and permitting, but also some of the state governments that will determine who has the authority to decide and how those processes happen. And yeah, those there's a lot of opportunity. Just answering the question here was asked, there's a lot of opportunity at the local and state level to continue working, regardless of what's taking place at the federal level. So definitely we will be busy. We will be busy over these next 4 years, no matter what. But Leif, do you have anything you'd add to this topic?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. I'm actually feeling a bit of hope just hearing what I've heard so far. So I think it might be helpful if I start by just kind of situating the sort of work that I do and where my expertise lies. So I'm a social psychologist. I study what ordinary people believe, why they believe what they believe, what their attitudes are, how they make decisions, how they react to political topics, divisive topics. So my area of expertise, what we do in the lab is we really try to understand why ordinary citizens respond the way they do to various difficult, challenging issues, whether it's COVID or climate change or political divisions. So with that as a backdrop, there are three things that we know about public opinion that actually give me a lot of hope for what might happen even in the near future. So one of the things we know is that the vast majority of people believe in climate change, recognize that climate change is caused by humans, think that if we reduce carbon emissions, we would address climate change, and they also experience some degree of concern that climate change impacts are already happening. Now, when I say that the vast majority of people believe this, that's especially true among Democrats, but it's also true among Republicans. So when we look at the data, and this is data that we've collected during the Biden administration, and it's also data that we've collected during the first Trump administration, the percentage of Democrats who kind of have all of those beliefs is about 85%. The percentage of Republicans who have all of those beliefs is about 65%. So the first thing that gives me hope is that people, by and large, on both sides of the political spectrum, recognize the reality of climate change. Having said that, there are kind of a couple of qualifications. So one is that when you ask people what other people think, so when you ask people, what does the American public believe, they dramatically underestimate how widespread the belief and concern about climate change is. So, I just told you that it's like 85% and 65% or so for Democrats, Republicans. People believe that it's about only 55% of Americans who recognize the reality of climate change. And if you ask them about Democrats and Republicans specifically, they really get Republicans wrong. They think that the minority of Republicans believe in climate change. So in other words, they think most Republicans are climate change skeptics, and that just doesn't show up in the data. So, on the one hand, there is this widespread belief and concern about needing to do something about climate change, recognizing how we could do it. On the other hand, there's this collective misperception that people are not concerned. There's even a collective misperception that people are more divided than they really are. And that then presents an opportunity in that if we can correct those misperceptions, if we can sort of better inform the public and policymakers and everyone involved in these conversations, just how kind of widespread this recognition about climate change is, that I think provides us with a real opportunity about how we might be able to move forward. So I have a lot more to say about different, data points, but I'll leave it there for now.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, we'll come back to talk a little bit more about the false polarization issue in just a moment. But Kate, would love to hear your thoughts. What is giving you hope right now about opportunities for the future?
So I think one thing has not been changed by the election results, which is the molecular structure of carbon dioxide. Will continue to be a greenhouse gas. Will continue to trap the heat coming from the planet. And so science, at least physical science, our results are largely unaffected by who's in charge. They're based on physics. They're based on stuff that we have understood for hundreds of years. I do think, as we look toward the future, there are going to be challenges, as there always are, but there's also going to be opportunities. I think it's an exciting opportunity, and I'd love to hear more from Leif about his work and what he's thinking about, because I think for a very long time, the way that scientists have engaged, not just with policymakers, but with the public at large, has been, if not flawed, kind of circumscribed. For a long time, I would say around 2018, the only story that was allowed to be told in popular media was, is climate change real? Here are a bunch of scientists who say it is, and here's one guy who says it's not. Let's watch them fight. I don't like that story. That's a boring story. I don't want to do it anymore. There was a brief period where there was a flurry of the only climate change story that could really be told was one of apocalypse and inevitability. And I don't like that story either. And I understand why people shut down. People shut down when they're being preached to. People shut down when they're being told that there is no hope. And I think now we have an opportunity to think about, how do we tell new stories? How do we communicate the science, not just to, high level policymakers, but people on the ground, people who are going to be affected by climate change or who are affected right now, which is honestly everybody.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, thinking about telling new stories, I think, is a perfect feed into picking up the thread that Leif left us with there about polarization. So Leif already mentioned this, the concept of false polarization, which is the fact that even though there's a broad assumption, even though the evidence shows that Americans overwhelmingly do understand that climate change is real, that there's this broad assumption that Americans are very polarized on this issue. And that assumption of polarization can actually become a barrier to creating progress, and specifically policy progress. So Leif, do you mind talking a little bit more about what opportunities you see for decreasing polarization around this issue moving forward? And I think maybe the storytelling element might be a part of that.
Yeah, how much time do we have? Yeah, I've been in the weeds on false polarization topics for quite a while, and I do think it's worth stepping back a little bit, considering issues beyond climate. Climate has, there are lots of additional complexities with climate, but let's just sort of ask the question generally about how divided Democrats and Republicans are, liberals and conservatives are within the US. When we've looked at data going all the way back to the late 60s from nationally representative surveys across a range of issues, whether it's, how to deal with what they called urban unrest or school busing, or how to deal with the USSR, or topics like affirmative action, on any of the kind of issues of the day. First of all, we do see that there are genuine divisions in ordinary people's stances. But what we also see is that people, again, believe those divisions are about twice as large as they actually are. So there's like this pervasive feature of the way the American public sees itself, that we think we are more divided than we really are. And what's kind of additionally interesting about that is, as you trace polarization over time on people's actual stances on those issues of the day, even as polarization is increasing somewhat, people's beliefs about polarization increases at an even greater rate. So it's not like we thought we were polarized when we weren't. Now we all are polarized and we accurately kind of see how the world is. We're always kind of exaggerating these differences. And that creates a huge barrier to addressing any of these divisive issues. And in a lot of ways, I would say climate change is not so different from COVID, affirmative action, healthcare, economic inequality, right? These are all things that we believe divide us more than they actually do. Part of the reason is that the stories that we hear are really about division. It's just not very interesting. Everyone loves to blame the media. I'll join in a little bit, but it's just not very interesting to say, yeah, most people agree. Everyone thinks we should do something about this. That's less entertaining than hearing about disagreement. And so, yeah, as Kate was mentioning, often what happens when we kind of hear about discussions in the media is we hear from one side and the other side. We're not really hearing a representative sample of what ordinary Americans believe. So there are some, as I was saying earlier, some real opportunities to kind of correct those misperceptions. And I think there's real urgency to do this sooner rather than later, because one of the areas where we see really, really dramatic polarization, where people are not wrong, is something that we refer to as affective polarization. That's how much we like and trust and feel warmly toward people on each end of the ideological spectrum. And people will routinely say that they dislike, distrust, and feel extremely cold toward people with different ideological views. They'll say things like, I wouldn't want my child to date someone with that political perspective. Things that you would never say about other groups is somehow okay for us to say about people with different political viewpoints. And that is a critical challenge that we need to address, and it kind of fuels some of these other misperceptions.
Yeah, I've experienced that. I feel like I started in the clean energy industry back in 2012. And in those days, local hearings where communities would be deciding whether to permit a project or not were often contentious, but people were relatively well behaved. We started to see first it really deteriorate online. When people in comment threads and chats would become very aggressive and towards each other very rapidly. And then we started seeing that show up in the actual hearings in person as well. And so it feels like even in the last 10 years, that's been getting worse. Is that what your research shows?
Well, like with many things, it's complicated. Yes, so it's gotten a lot worse in terms of what people say about the other side. What is also happening is that the kind of political social conflicts are becoming normalized in a way that they really haven't been before. And they're normalized at the level of, I'll just say mean-spiritedness rather than thoughtful engagement, right? So this idea that we can engage on ideas where we disagree, but still have kind of a respectful set of shared values and sense of community and commonality, that's starting to wane, and that's a real problem that we need to address collectively. And bringing it back to the climate context, climate has become such a polarized issue. Even though that polarization is exaggerated in our minds, it kind of fuels the way that we interact and have debates with each other. And it's really true kind of on both sides, right? So each side digs in their heels and they feel like they can't give anything because if they give in, they're surrendering and the other side is going to take advantage of them. And we're really kind of losing the sense of collaborative disagreement and communal sense of purpose.
Yeah, well, I think that that's actually a good segue into our next question, which is that we have seen some really exciting examples of Republican leadership and solutions coming out of states, as well as previous federal, Republican administrations. What do any of you have, favorite stories about some great examples of some of the climate leadership we've seen coming out of states or coming out of Republican administrations that might give us some idea of some opportunities coming forward?
Dahvi, maybe I'll jump in with a little bit of my past experience in Congress that was coming to mind as Leif was talking, as well as some of what we've seen here during the Biden administration. But as Kristen said, my last job in Congress was as staff director for the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. And select committees are special committees that are created to kind of focus on an issue or an investigation, and they're kind of additive to the standing legislative and appropriation committees in Congress. And so our job was to look at the climate crisis in a cross-cutting way. And it was, we had a slate of Democrats, the Republican caucus put forward their Republicans, and was led by Garrett Graves, was the senior Republican, and Kathy Castor from Florida was the chair and my boss. And we really found a lot of common ground on the challenges that America was facing, either from the energy side or the climate impact side. And we actually, in all of our hearings, had fairly constructive engagement on the problems we were facing. And so then the challenge is moving to the solutions. That's where the two parties really start to divide. But I certainly, having started in DC as a freshly minted climate scientist in 2001, have seen a lot of things happen. And it used to be, as Kate said, we were debating about whether this phenomenon was real. So, there definitely is a group of Republicans, in part because the climate impacts are sort of undeniable now. They're living them in every extreme rainstorm, in every hot summer and heat wave. And so, Republican lawmakers and elected officials at whatever level have to be responsive to their constituents. And so as people are asking for help on these things, they're responding. So we're in a better place, that we're not just fighting over the science, and finding some common ground. And I hope that strain of the Republican Party continues. I think it's also independents are really important on understanding what's happening on the science side of things. And so then we have to just keep working to see where we can find policy agreements. And there were some that we were able to get on, especially on the resilience side of things. Actually, during President Trump's first term, Congress in 2018 moved through some legislation that helps helps communities prepare for extreme weather before it happens. And that was really Republican-led program that's now in place at FEMA. And then right at the end, in 2020, once Democrats had come back and we were in control of the House, there was a lot of engagement on energy innovation. And so right at the end of 2020 and the big omnibus appropriations package, there was actually the Energy Policy Act of 2020, which authorized a bunch of programs on clean energy at the Department of Energy that then were subsequently funded as part of the infrastructure law in 2021. But really, one that totally went under the radar was also direction to EPA to establish rules around HFCs that are coolants, and they come under another global international treaty, the Montreal Protocol, that deals with the ozone hole, but they have greenhouse gas properties. And so there was an international agreement that was finalized in Kigali, Rwanda, to say we should start phasing these out. And we actually there had bipartisan agreement to phase out these chemicals, to drive innovation to different chemicals that don't have the same greenhouse gas warming characterizations or characters. And that was done in a bipartisan way. And ultimately, actually, the Senate even ratified that international treaty amendment, the Kigali Amendment, to really put it in place, which is a fairly unusual thing to have achieved in this day and age. So, there are still ways we can find common ground to work together. And, just going back to the Inflation Reduction Act, much of that investment is flowing to red states. And we have governors and local leaders who are, really working to attract that investment and see it bring economic development to their communities. And I know probably a lot of folks in the audience are worried about the fate of the Inflation Reduction Act in the coming years. I think Congress will be debating that for sure. But we already have seen signs, earlier this year, 18 House Republicans wrote a letter to Speaker Johnson urging him not to repeal all of the IRA energy tax credits. Governors in South Carolina, Oklahoma, Georgia are all sort of competing to get clean energy investments in their states. So I think, people see that it can be an economic and jobs driver and want to see that continue.
Thanks, Anna. Kate, do you have anything you'd like to add? I'm thinking about some of Anna's stories there and wondering if some of those stories are reliant, or some of those examples are reliant upon different ways of talking about solutions and policies. I'm curious if you have thoughts that you'd add.
Yeah, I think, I'm going to steal this from somebody. I forget who said it, but the problems are getting worse, but the solutions are getting better. And I think that's absolutely true. If you had told me at the beginning of my career how cheap wind and solar were, and how salient this issue would be with a large swath of the public, I probably wouldn't have believed you. I would have said that's way too optimistic. And so I think it is undeniable now that we can talk about mitigation in a way that is truly either bipartisan or even more expansive than bipartisan. We can talk about mitigation in terms of the range of options that we have. In the National Climate Assessment that came out last year, where I was involved in the leadership team, we have a mitigation chapter. And that mitigation chapter is presenting options, trying to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive, saying, here are the things that could be done that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think being able to tell a proactive, positive story among the stories of destruction and doom, I think that is very, very useful to have that tool in our toolkit.
Yeah, thank you. How about switching gears a little bit? How about the industry side of things? Are folks seeing exciting opportunities coming out of the energy industry or other industries that we should be thinking about and focusing in on in these next several years?
Well, Dahvi, climate change solutions really depend on energy change solutions. And Kate pointed out a really important one there, which is the just dramatic drop in the cost of renewables. And probably back in the start of her career, you also wouldn't have thought we'd have these great big batteries that we can store electricity in and start, making sure that those wind and solar are kind of on-demand energy drivers. So one of the things I've been working on a lot here in my time in the Biden administration is actually geothermal energy. And I think that's a great example of up and coming clean energy source, that can be delivered on demand and be a little more base load. And there really are a lot of exciting things happening in the technology space there. But what is also great about it is some of, geoscientists, engineers, rednecks, as I would call them, from my time growing up in Texas near the oil fields, they all can take those skills that they have developed in the oil industry and bring them to the geothermal industry. And we're seeing a lot of the companies that are growing right now that's their target audience. They're going to folks who have earned their experience in the oil field and saying, hey, come work on geothermal with us. And so it's been great to be in the administration, because we also have been trying to do as much as we can to support geothermal energy, especially because a lot of our best geothermal resources in America are out west on public lands. So the Bureau of Land Management has really had a good focus on this. They've just in October approved a company called Fervo's Cape Geothermal Power Project in Beaver County, Utah. So just a little north and west of those folks in Denver. And it's going to use this really great technology to generate up to 2 gigawatts of baseload power. And for those of you not conversant in gigawatts, that's like basically 2 nuclear power plants, that are providing a ton of electricity, and to supply up to 2 million homes, if that's a better metric for you. And so, that also, they approved that. They also had a recent lease sale, and it was the second biggest lease sale ever, and a big jump from just the year before. And I think that's just an indication of both the technology proving itself, and the need. We have growing electricity requirements, and it's great to see it, coming together for a clean energy source that I think holds a lot of promise. And then one of the things that our team has been working on is helping make sure we have NEPA reviews and some tools there to really speed up the permitting for figuring out the resources that are out there, and some of the other requirements as companies are trying to go out and identify places that they could build some of these new plants. So I'm very excited about geothermal, and it's been great to be working on that for the last couple of years.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any contributions on this one, or we can move to our next question? I mean, one thought that I have is that the technologies are good, and we have this increasing diversity of technologies becoming available that fit somewhere in this clean energy space. And all of them are facing, various forms of pushback or resistance, because siting things is hard. And all of these technologies are often very large infrastructure projects, which always come with some pushback, probably from the public, especially in communities where folks are concerned that these new technologies getting introduced will change the identity and the nature of the place where they live, really affect their sense of place. Leif, we didn't prepare for this, so you can pass if you want, but I'm wondering, do you have any research in this work that you've been doing that sort of gives us some thoughts on how to move forward on these kinds of siting challenges around a public acceptance of these kinds of projects getting introduced?
Sure. So yeah, we have some work that we've been doing for a couple of years that is somewhat adjacent that has to do with trying to understand the basis of public receptiveness to new technologies. So we've been looking at everything from lab-grown meats as, low carbon protein alternatives to carbon removal to nuclear to, different kinds of, more natural sort of afforestation strategies. And part of what we have in mind is some of the work in public risk perception from the 1980s and kind of what happened with the debates around nuclear energy, which, part of what came out of that was an appreciation that the way the public thinks about some of the benefits and risks don't always correspond to the way engineers think about benefits and risks. And a lot of the things about, technologies that are unfamiliar or, unknown or seem unnatural in particular is something we've been working on. The public really feels like they're dangerous, and that can quickly escalate into pretty strong opposition to those technologies. So as you were talking, I was curious because we haven't looked exactly at geothermal technology, but I can certainly imagine that one where it's very open to the stories you tell about it. Is it a natural kind of technology that provides more natural energy, or is it that we're intervening in some unnatural, artificial way with the way the Earth operates that could really blow up, maybe literally? So again, the stories and the way people sort of construe those technologies matters a lot. The bigger issue, I think, and this goes to the siting point, is that people really need to see someone who they trust explaining, just explaining what is going to happen, being honest about the uncertainties, being honest about the impacts, but also conveying that all of the kind of benefits and costs are going to be taken together. And, one of the challenges that we face, kind of like we were talking about earlier, is that there are a lot of people who we don't trust. And we need to ensure, I think, as we have these conversations, whether it's, at the state, federal, or very local level, that there's someone who people feel that they can trust as representing their interests participating in those discussions. Because it's kind of asking a lot for the average citizen to weigh all of the information and make a fully informed. I mean, I don't have that kind of time in my day, and I think most people don't either. So whether it's government or business, this issue of trust and how we make sense of these new technologies and how they get installed and whether that's going to perpetuate, historical inequities, these are all things that really deserve close attention to better understand.
Yeah, and we've talked a little bit about how this kind of phenomenon is part of the reason why, if we can break down the partisan elements of this work, there could be really significant impacts because we're sort of we've broken ourselves down into these tribes that help us determine who we trust on different issues. And Leif, you've said that there's evidence that if the Republicans do start taking some leadership on some of these issues, it could have a really significant impact more rapidly because of that dynamic.
Yes, indeed. Is that it? Is that an invitation to elaborate?
Yes, yes, it is. Please do.
So this was something that wasn't our purpose of doing these studies over the years, but it was something we noticed again and again and again, that one of the questions we're interested in is how people respond differently to climate solutions when they're proposed by Democrats or when they're proposed by Republicans. So take the same thing and just ask the question, does it matter who's proposing the idea? Right? It kind of harkens back to some of the discussions about healthcare. Does it matter if it's a Romney healthcare plan or an Obama healthcare plan? Turns out that it does. Same thing with climate policy, right? So people are sensitive to where the policy comes from, who's proposing it. But partly as a consequence of that, because climate tends to be more of a central issue for Democrats, it tends to be a higher priority for Democrats. When we present a climate solution as coming from Democrats, Democratic leadership specifically, Democrats love it. Republicans, not so much. They're, it's sort of just below 50% would sort of endorse the solution. So pretty big divide. When we present the same thing, but coming from Republican leaders, Democrats drop a little bit. So maybe that number drops from like 85% to 70%. But Republican support goes up dramatically. So it might go up from like 45% to also very close to 75%. So we've noticed again and again that you could almost eliminate the partisan difference in support for climate solutions when it comes from conservative Republican leadership. And part of what we think is going on there, although it's subject to, further examination, is that there's more ambivalence about climate solutions on the Republican end of public opinion. And what they're really looking for is, do I see someone who I trust is advocating a solution, who I trust is going to balance all of the considerations at play, really have concern about the economy and jobs. And we've seen in national polling that Republicans poll better on those kinds of issues. And so for all of those reasons, if Republican leadership decides to take action on climate solutions, there's a very real potential that it would be less polarizing than Democratic leadership taking action. So, as we like to say, if there's a will, there's definitely a way they can do it.
Thank you. So we're talking about, channels of information and who different communities trust to deliver that information. I want to turn that a little bit to a conversation about the media, where this dynamic is certainly in effect. Curious about how you all think the changing media landscape might affect the role of climate science in our civil discourse, or how you see this changing our understanding of the energy economy over time. And what's the role of scientists in through these different media channels in the media landscape?
So I think the short answer to your question is I have no idea, but I will give you a little bit of a longer answer. So I feel my age. Kids these days and their TikTok. I don't understand what's going on. I don't understand where anybody's getting any information. But what I do know two things. I do know that historically and currently, effective science communication is not incentivized by the academy. It is seen as something that's kind of nice to do. You can do it on your own time. But if you're too good at it, you're fundamentally a little suspect. And things are changing with the new generation of student scientists coming through who really do believe that there is a communication imperative. But things are not changing rapidly. And there is this sort of historical barrier of this attitude to overcome. Another thing that I think looking forward into the future will be really helpful is engagement, not just with traditional journalistic media, where a journalist comes and asks a scientist something and the scientist says something from our, I guess not ivory tower, I don't have one of those, but from our privileged position, and expects everybody to listen to us and expects it to be a one-way dialogue. I think the utility of that is somewhat limited. And so there's opportunities to engage in different community contexts. There's also opportunities to engage through things like art and fiction, right? We've talked a lot about storytelling. And I think Kendra Pierre-Louis, who is a journalist at Bloomberg, pointed this out to me, and it blew my mind that, oh, in the Marvel movies, the villains are usually environmental activists, right? Like Thanos wants to kill half of the universe in order to prevent overpopulation because he's, I guess, an environmentalist. I don't know. I wasn't paying attention when I watched that movie. But the point is that we don't have a lot of compelling climate stories. We don't have a lot of engagement through the media, the fictional media, through film, through books, through storytelling. It's usually either post-apocalyptic wasteland or, I think that's basically it, post-apocalyptic wasteland. And I think because I've said this before, climate change does affect every living thing on Earth. That is an incredible amount of stories to tell that aren't just gloom and doom, that aren't just fear, that aren't just anger, but touch on the other things that we can feel about climate change, that touch on things like wonder and pride and hope and love. And I think that is sort of a neglected area of how do we engage with creators of fictional narratives.
That's great. And I want to stay with you for just a second
Yeah.
to ask a follow-up, which is,
Oh,
you know,
can I
yeah.
plus one on the art and culture piece? Actually, early in my career, I spent some time at the Center for American Progress, and one of my favorite panels I put together was just about that, bringing art in. So I had, some of you may know Kim Stanley Robinson, who's a science fiction writer. His Ministry for the Future made a big splash the last few years. My favorite is The Green Earth. So if you want a more positive view, go back to, it's a little older, go pick that one up and read it. But I had him, I had a photographer, I had a documentarian, I had a woman who was working on sort of PSAs on climate, and that really is super neglected. It's getting more attention now, but definitely an area we need to focus on. And as part of that, I posited, what if Ross on Friends had been a climatologist rather than a paleontologist? Like, would we have been in a better place for climate science? Although probably now I think about the Big Bang Theory, I'm like, why wasn't somebody, an atmospheric physicist in their gang of friends there? So there really are a lot of opportunities, and I think if you look at places where we've made dramatic social change, TV, movies can be a big player in that. So there are some efforts there, and I'm glad to hear them, and I wish those folks working on all of that the best.
I heard a great story. I was at a meeting with Professor Jeffrey Jaquette, who was at Ohio State, I believe, and he was talking about a community that he had worked in where a coal plant was shutting down, and that the community was somebody, I'm not sure who organized this, but they put together a community drama presentation. They did a play that was the community having the funeral for the coal plant. And what he described from that process was that there was this real need to mourn the passage of what had been this really deeply embedded part of this community for generations, and many folks had worked there, and their whole lives had been built based on that experience, and that they needed that community sort of reenactment, that fictionalized funeral for the coal plant to move on to being ready to take on what was going to come next. So that's a different version, but I thought that was so interesting. But Kate, I wanted to ask you about, you brought up some of those values judgments that, humans have, and scientists are humans, so many of them have them too. How do you think scientists should acknowledge the values and beliefs that they hold without compromising their scientific expertise?
I mean, I'd love to hear how Anna has navigated this in her career. My own personal view is that striving for perfect, value-free, neutral objectivity is not going to work. If I say I have no values, I have no beliefs, that doesn't make me objective. That makes me a liar. And I don't think you should trust science coming from people who are lying about things. So I think we can't pretend that we don't have values and beliefs. So I'm not sure that the right way to approach these questions as scientists is objectivity necessarily. I think the right way for us to address it is humility. The fact that I can tell you, I know how to solve equations, right? Like, I know how to do geophysical fluid dynamics on a sphere. Great. That's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And because most people don't spend a lot of time thinking about this, because this turns out they have better things to do, that gives me a little bit of expertise in this really narrowly defined part of the world. It does not give me expertise in things like what is the right thing to do vis-a-vis policy. It does not give me expertise in what is the best way to talk about this to achieve a certain goal. It doesn't allow me to know the things that Leaf just told me, right? We need other areas of expertise. And I think if you say I am a science robot and I have no feelings or beliefs or humanity, people are going to see through that. Nobody's going to believe you. But if you say, here's what I know and here's what I know I don't know, That is an invitation to a conversation. And conversations, I think, are much more productive than lectures.
Thanks. I was looking back at my notes from the talk last night because I think this resonates with some of the points that you made as well about bringing your whole self to this work and also knowing bringing your area of expertise and being ready to expand into other areas as well. But Anna, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, when I have the opportunity to talk to scientists who are thinking about engagement and advocacy, I always remind them scientists are citizens too. And so we really need their expertise. I think when scientists succeed, it's often by being able to say, this is what I know from my work and area of expertise, and sort of connect the dots to then, and that informs me in believing that this is a good policy. But I think, as Kate said, trying to you can't deny that you have values and opinions and all of those things, but to the extent you can be sort of clear what is coming from you as a person and a citizen and a member of a community, and what is your work and that information, I think is super helpful. But we definitely need those voices, and I certainly part of why I've chosen my career path and what I've learned, is we're in a democracy. It's messy at times because people bring their, it's not just the scientific facts, the economic impacts, your own values, your group's values, all come into play. But if we don't have the expertise from folks like Kate and others who are spending their time studying those, pieces of science that we need to help us base our policy decisions, then our policy decisions are going to be that much poorer for it.
Go ahead, Leif.
Yeah, I think a really challenging question that we, maybe especially in the university academic community, need to grapple with is what are the different perspectives that are represented in the the humble acknowledgement that we're bringing particular perspectives and beliefs and political orientations to the table, and even as we strive to be objective, we acknowledge that those things could affect us. I mean, we definitely know that they affect other people. It's easy to see it in other people. It's really hard to see in ourselves. But, one of the challenges I think for a lot of people when they look at debates in certain settings is that they're not two-sided. And they're not two-sided even in context where there is a lot of uncertainty. So I just glanced and saw a comment in the chat about, weighing the benefits of addressing climate change versus the economic benefits. There's a lot of uncertainty there that is relevant to a lot of areas in the social sciences. And it includes some value judgments and some, sort of analysis of moral principles. And very reasonable, neutral striving people could disagree and should disagree when they come at it from different perspectives. And then, of course, part of the way we hope we eventually discover some sort of general truths is by a process of disagreement and evaluating claims against the evidence. And I do think a fair criticism, and certainly something that the public knows about a lot of settings, is that debate is very much one-sided. And so again, going back to the issues of trust, people need to see sort of two-sided debates about values relevant science as it pertains to these really difficult discussions, right? So it's kind of, to say that all the scientists agree that we should do X when all the scientists have a similar political orientation isn't super compelling to people who are inclined to be skeptical, right? So we should be mindful about, not only the humility and the disagreement, but kind of acknowledging that there is room for debate with people from different perspectives.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about uncertainty, but before I do, I just want to let everyone know that we are watching the chat. So please, we're gonna turn to questions in just a moment. So if you have any you want to add into the list there, please feel free to do so. But before we turn to that, do any others have comments you want to share about how you see the role of uncertainty affecting support for climate policies? No takers. Okay.
Oh, sorry, you
Kate,
you
go
go.
ahead. You go.
I don't know how uncertainty affects support for climate policies or not, but I know how I think about how to talk about, communicate, and deal with uncertainty in my own world and in my own research. There are some things that we are incredibly certain about, right? We know carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. We know these are greenhouse gases. We know that their concentrations have increased. We know the human activities that are increasing those concentrations. Then there are certain things that we know very well because they follow from physics. We know that when the atmosphere gets warmer, we should expect heavier downpours because warm air holds more water vapor. We know that we should expect more droughts because warm air is thirstier air. We know that hurricanes, we should expect more strong hurricanes, even if we don't know if we should expect more total hurricanes, because warm water is hurricane food. So we know a lot about the very basic physics that underlies this. And we as scientists have a really hard time talking about stuff that we know, because the very nature of our jobs is to do the stuff that we don't know, right? Like, we're not showing up at work, rolling balls down an inclined plane and like mixing vinegar and baking soda every day. We're doing stuff that we don't know. But then at the same time, there is a lot of stuff that we are working on that we don't know. And I think the thing to stress, and what I talk about when I talk to people about this, is that the uncertainty is what scares me. If we knew that, okay, we can increase emissions up to exactly this point, and then we go off some kind of cliff, or then we know exactly what the consequences would be, then that would put us in a very different decision-making environment than we are right now. There's a lot of attention being paid recently to tipping points, things that essentially will get broken in the climate system that will never be fixed again on timescales relevant to us or human civilizations. Things like the shutdown of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, things like the dieback of the Amazon, things like the collapse of the ice sheets. We really do not have any good idea about when these tipping elements might be exceeded. It is very, very hard to get a climate model to tip. It is very, very hard to understand all of the complex processes that might affect something like that. All we know is that the risk of those very, very bad and effectively irreversible things increases as the temperature increases. And so that, to me, is not a comforting thing. The fact that there is inherent uncertainty in the climate system. I've often had people ask me, when do I have to sell my beach house? And I wish I could say, all right, at 10 a.m. on January 30th, 2032, that is when you have to sell your beach house because something is coming the day afterwards. I can't say that. Nobody can say that. We do not have that information at either that level of temporal resolution or that level of spatial granularity. And that doesn't mean that we know nothing, right? Uncertainty is not the same thing as ignorance, but there is uncertainty, and we will have to make those decisions under very, very deep uncertainty. But I've seen a lot of times that uncertainty being used as a comfort, and to me, it is the exact opposite.
Kate, I have a question for you based on something you just said, and maybe it relates to the uncertainty and my ignorance. So, in talking about the tipping points, you mentioned that it's very hard to get a climate model to tip. And as a naive person, I might think, Well, maybe that means the model's not very good. Why should I have confidence in the model? And so I hear you telling me two things, that the model is good, but there are some things that's really hard to get the model to do that you actually think is a real possibility. Can you help me reconcile those two things?
Yeah, so models are very good at representing the things that we have seen so far, right? If you run a model back in time, it will show you the temperature rise, more or less, that we have actually observed. Models are very, very good at capturing things that we know. When it comes to something like a tipping point, we haven't experienced those things yet. They are wildly out of sample, and they are incredibly complex. So the reason that models are very good at what they're good at is that we know the physics behind those things really well, right? Like models generally project more intense downpours. And that's because we can write down the equation that tells us to expect more water vapor in a hotter atmosphere. The things that models struggle with are generally things that are extremely complex, right? So something like the Amazon rainforest. The Amazon rainforest is a bunch of stuff that is growing in a very particular place. The Amazon rainforest is fertilized by dust blowing in from the Sahara. The trees in the Amazon make their own weather. They essentially exhale so much water vapor that they prime the sky and they sort of draw in the monsoon. All of these things are incredibly complex. They're not something really simple and straightforward, like warm air is thirstier air or warm water is hurricane food. And that's something that in that complexity, it's not necessarily that climate models aren't credible. It's that this stuff is genuinely extremely difficult to understand. And the uncertainty lies in that complexity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a few comments about there's a whole literature on science communication and uncertainty, and we in our lab group started doing some reading in this area during the pandemic for obvious reasons. And one of the things that was really interesting was how people respond to kind of changes in models or changes in predictions. And what's really problematic is when there are changes that are not explained, right? So you say, we thought one thing, now we think something else, or there's this thing and we don't know what's going to happen. That diminishes confidence in the model and then the whole endeavor. But if you can kind of explain, here's what we know, here are the limits of what we know, and here's why these are reasonable limits that maybe in the future won't be so limiting, then public confidence actually goes up and is quite tolerant of changing recommendations, for example, if there's an acknowledgement and just an explanation of what is happening. It's the absence of the explanation, sort of assuming that maybe the public can't handle those complexities that ends up ultimately undermining confidence. So what you just did, I thought was a great example of like, here's something that we don't know or that might be uncertain, but here's why, and here's how we might eventually overcome those limits of knowledge.
I totally agree with you. I think, my personal experience, and you obviously have engaged much more with the literature on this than I have, but just my anecdotal experience is that people are curious. You're right that people are time limited. People don't have the time to evaluate and research everything themselves. But if you are talking to somebody about something, you say, this is uncertain, and they say, oh, why? And if you can engage with that curiosity aspect, which seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, curiosity seems to be one of the last urges that's relatively depoliticized. I think we're all allowed to be curious. And that's a really good fit for scientists because we're kind of professionally curious.
Dahvi, can I add something on uncertainty and policymaking? Because obviously we live in an uncertain world, but a president has to decide whether to sign a bill or veto a bill, and a senator or member of Congress has to decide whether to vote for a bill or not. And so I think that is one of the reasons when we're evaluating policies, whether, we may be motivated to have more clean energy in order to, stop the rise of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, stop the heating of our planet. But we don't know exactly how much we have to deploy, or all of those uncertainty pieces. But if we have a policy that's going to help us deploy more non-carbon polluting technology, and also means that manufacturing is going to happen in the United States, and we'll have some tangible benefit of additional manufacturing and jobs and economic development. That's why some of that drive for that really tangible results of policy we are often trying to twin those together, just because ultimately if you're the elected official, or you're a staffer to the elected official, you have to help them make a sort of black or white decision, even in the face of uncertainty.
Yes. Well, this is great. I want to turn to some of the comments and questions that we've gotten from participants. One, just to note, it's not really a question, but I did note several comments coming in that are pointing out that at the beginning of the conversation, we were talking about how the narrative now out there is less about the fact that climate change isn't real, and it's shifting. And several comments have noticed, commenters have indicated how they've seen it shifting. So, one person noted that they see the arguments shifting more towards trying to promote despair, trying to double down on the sort of uncertainty aspect of science as a way to maybe push back against the climate policies being proposed. And then another argument that maybe the solutions aren't worth the cost, even if climate change really is happening. So just a note on that, I will say, like, from my experience on the clean energy side, about 12 years ago, there was a gathering of some of the folks who would become some of the nation's largest anti-renewable advocates. And they met to talk about how to effectively fight back against clean energy projects. And there's a memo that's on the internet from those days. And one of the strategies that they talked about in that memo about how to kill projects was to really stress the scientific uncertainty. So their argument was, don't say that you think this is bad or you don't want it. Say instead, point out instead that the science isn't clear, and that we really shouldn't invest in something where we don't know. So that did resonate for me in one of the comments. But I want to turn to one of the questions that came up. One question pointed out that we often hear folks describe the need to do their own research now, and they often look to the internet to do that. How do we manage that when the power of influencers on the internet, who may know very little about the actual science, is equivalent or even more powerful than the voices of scientists? Does anybody want to weigh in on how can we help the public navigate that reality? Lee, can I give that to you?
I was going to say, I'll jump in and say, I mean, that's a crucial question and a really tough one. Having been, I would say science and scientists, even though they've taken a knock at various times, still are fairly trusted messengers in our country. And that's one reason why politicians who are not often try and refer to scientists. But everything's just really evolving. I have a teenager, so I learn about TikTok based on what I am asked from my teenager seeing. And thankfully, she's cognizant enough to be like, is that real? But we need to, I think, encourage a lot more of that question in everybody. Is that real? And have places they feel they can go to get those answers, which maybe Lise can tell us how that works.
It's a brave new world for sure. I wanted to reiterate something that you just said, Anna, that scientists are still, by and large, one of the most trusted groups by the American public. And in a lot of the discussion about the declining trust in science, that's true. Levels of trust in scientists and science has been declining, but the degree to which scientists are trusted much more than other, you know, leader groups within society, especially politicians, even from people's own party, is still it's still extremely high. So we shouldn't lose sight of that fact. We should be really concerned about that maybe, but we shouldn't lose sight of that fact. Um, I was at a conference recently and listening to a number of presentations about misinformation and receptiveness to misinformation and sort of who's prone and under what conditions. And one of the points that one of the speakers made from a large scale study that they had done is that when you look at the actual information landscape and you kind of, construct careful experiments to figure out what are people responding to, a huge problem is not that necessarily that people are believing things that are false. That's actually a smaller portion of what seems to be going on. A huge problem seems to be that they're not believing the things that are true. So it's not that they're embracing false statements so much as they are failing to recognize and embrace true statements that are made. And I think that changes the conversation a little bit about what it means to, kind of construct a beneficial information landscape. And then the other thing I'll just mention quickly is we had a paper come out relatively recently. This was in the context of looking at media consumption and COVID vaccines and trust in science. And one of the things we were interested in, this was a correlational study and somewhat exploratory, but we were interested in this idea of the ideological diversity of media. So you could look at, different media sources and then figure out the degree to which someone generally consumes liberal media or conservative media. But then you could also look at how much do they kind of look to ideological diversity of their media outlets. And it turns out that that ideological diversity has a bunch of benefits. It actually predicts higher vaccination rates. It depolarizes trust in science. We have some other data that it depolarizes, belief in climate change and attitudes toward climate policy. So there seems to be something in hearing a number of different viewpoints on the same issue that helps people kind of reason more rationally about the situation. So it might be more productive to say, instead of don't consume that, don't consume from that source, that's bad, to instead encourage people to consume a variety of sources, to seek out a variety of different perspectives. And if you can then fight the algorithms that are going against diversity of perspectives, then maybe you'd have a winning answer.
Can I answer that with a question for Leif and Anna? How should scientists like me talk about the times when we got it wrong? And it kind of strikes me that there's two big ways that scientists can get it wrong. And I've definitely done both of these things because I'm a human being. But you can get the science wrong. You can say, well, we thought X, but then these observations came out and they show that X is not true. But we can also get it wrong by saying, oh, I really strongly advocated for this thing. And I was kind of ideologically blinkered. I was saying it came from a scientific perspective, but it was actually very much my own personal beliefs. So how should we talk about making those two mistakes or getting those two things wrong, if we should at all?
I think the last part, if we should at all, we absolutely have to acknowledge when there's a mistake. And I think it kind of goes back to, what Leif highlighted in your explanation of the model, just being able to walk things through. I know that's hard in a 30-second TikTok world that we live in, that nuance is lost. But I think it's also part of telling that story. That's one of the powers of science, is that it is a mechanism to try and to self-correct as we learn more. But I don't think there's a silver bullet, other than laying it out there and then trying to explain by where you are now, the evidence that brings you to that conclusion.
Yeah, I think we are often, when we think about changing our minds, we're thinking in the kind of political sense, and the anecdotes of Kerry being a flip-flopper, ring true. But that's a different context where I think part of the reaction to that is that the reason people are changing their minds is that it's strategic and they're trying to take advantage of shifting winds, and that's a very different circumstance than getting new evidence or even coming to newfound appreciation that your previous assessment of the evidence was maybe contaminated by ideology or bias. Well, first of all, I think we need a lot more research on these topics, right? To understand like what are the best ways to communicate and acknowledge about uncertainty and about mistakes that we've made. And how do we kind of admit to those things in a way that can strengthen confidence in the overall endeavor and even of the person who's admitting to those mistakes and trying to do better going forward. And I think the public is generally quite forgiving of those kind of honest assessments. Again, it goes back to the point you made earlier, Kate, about needing to be kind of humble in our evaluation of the evidence and admitting to what we don't know. We did look a lot at the literature, as I was mentioning, and there's a lot out there. There's a lot of insights we can glean. But as I just mentioned, there's also a lot more that could be done, right? And so one of the things I think we would want to invest in as we move forward is really to further develop an understanding of a scientific understanding of communicating about science and how to do that effectively.
Thank you. All right, I think we have time for about one more question. We have a question about, we had a panel previously about AI, so maybe I'll pick up this one. AI is going to require a lot of energy, as we know, and it may hinder some of our progress on these climate solutions. Do folks have thoughts on what that means for us and how significant of an issue that's likely to be as we try to achieve, some climate goals?
I'll jump in. It's definitely, I think, an area that is getting a lot of attention all across the policymaking world, in part because it is a big change. We're facing a big change. It's one of the three big changes I've seen in my career, is that suddenly electricity demand is going up rather than being flat or declining. And we anticipated some of it from the electrification that we need for decarbonization. But, just this pulse of AI, I think, has caught people somewhat by surprise. I think the good news is many of the companies who are driving that innovation also, want to find ways to power it with clean energy. We do have a history of a lot of, oh no, we're going to need a lot of energy. And then it turns out as things progress and the technology actually matures and things actually come online, we don't need as much. So I think there is a challenge right now of, really, I think we will need more electricity. How much more is really a big part of the question. And so I think, people are focused on trying to figure out ways to solve that, bringing that generation on more quickly and more cleanly to meet the need. from my perspective, one of the earliest energy policies I worked on was energy efficiency. And it is still one of the hardest things to get done in the US, even though we have a huge place to draw on. So in part, I am kind of hoping, and I'm seeing sort of emerging sprouts that recognizing this really near-term demand for electricity will actually drive us to get a lot more serious and smart on energy efficiency policies and using some of the tools we already have. One of my favorite things that my friends at DOE are working on are virtual power plants to kind of connect together all the various smart appliances, solar power, and batteries that we have out there to kind of build a virtual power plant. And I think there's a lot of promise there. And I also hope, just in general on some of the building efficiency that we could do that would lower demand elsewhere. So.
Thank you. So before we leave, I want to give each of you just a moment to share any last thoughts that this conversation has put into your mind that you didn't get to share yet. We don't have a ton of time, so keep it a little tight, but I'd love to give everyone a chance. Kate, do you want to do any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, I guess, it has become really clear to me that just sitting around waiting for an elected leader, whoever that is, to come along and do everything for us has never been a good strategy. And we should not be doing that. I think we as scientists need to be talking directly to people. We need to let our research be guided by the questions that people are interested in. And I think the final thing is we need to recognize that people want to be entertained, and there's nothing wrong with that. I personally would rather watch John Wick than An Inconvenient Truth, and that's fine. And so realizing that the traditional, very, very boring, dry lecturing ways of science communication aren't necessarily going to cut it anymore.
Thank you. Leif, any thoughts from you?
I'll just add that being in a university setting and being around a lot of young people who are passionate about these issues is actually really pretty inspiring. And hearing more today about the different solutions and seeing that younger people with ambition and a lot more energy, speaking of energy demand than I have, really is an opportunity that we should embrace and channel, and I think a real source of optimism. So keep sending students our way.
Thank you. And Anna, any last thoughts from you?
Well, yeah, just add to Leif's there that I think young people's passion and understanding about this really impacting their future is really driving a lot of action as well as motivation. And I think we'll just close going back to uncertainty. The thing that drives the most uncertainty and what our climate future is actually what we humans choose to do when it comes to our energy use. And so the cynic might look at that and be like, oh gosh, but the optimist in me looks at that and says, okay, it's in our hands. We can do it. We all have agency here. And that's what is really kind of most important, whether it's in local communities trying to build clean energy, or coming to Washington, D.C. to advocate for federal policy, and even just what you choose to do in your individual life. I hope people can feel empowered by that they can make a difference, and that they want to keep trying to make a difference.
Thank you. Well, virtual applause, I'm sure, for our entire virtual audience here. Thanks everyone so much. Kristen, welcome back. Thanks so much for letting us talk about this today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dahvi, Anna, Leif, and Kate, for such a really thoughtful conversation. I've been taking some notes and doing my own noodling on it, particularly around how do we talk about tipping points or not. So Just wanted to thank you all very much for your time, your expertise, and your perspective. Thoroughly enjoyed myself, and hopefully you have a wonderful holiday, and giving you all a virtual round of claps as well too. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and invite our President and CEO of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science to join us here on the stage as well for some closing thoughts and remarks. So George Sparks, for those of you who probably know who this gentleman is the President and CEO of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. There he is. Hi, George.
Hi, how are you, Kristen?
I'm doing well. How are you doing today?
Good. What a great day.
What a great day. So
Yeah.
what stuck out for you? Anything really resonated from any of today's conversations?
Oh, I've got a whole list of stuff here. First off, I want to thank you and your team and the moderators today and the panelists for an exceptional day and evening last night. I mean, you folks make all this happen, and I'm just really humbled to be able to work with you. So thank you to everybody involved here. So a few big things stuck out for me. One was this continuing comments about trust, that we have to rebuild trust in our institutions, in our personal relationships. And that starts with each and every one of us, either individually or as organizations. So as you know, the Institute was built to regain trust in science. I was also really impressed by the caliber of leadership of the people, both last night and today, that are engaged on these things. We're really blessed to have people of this character and competence to be working on this. I'm a rabid free market capitalist, very anti-regulation, but I think after living through the social media world, I think it's time that we do begin to regulate AI before it gets out of control here. I do wonder if in 2010 we had known where social media would go, could we have set rules in place that would have kept it between the lines as opposed to what it's turned into today? I don't know the answer to that, but I am hopeful and glad that we're at least pondering AI with respect to this. And a caution to all of us, this is a very US-centered discussion here. So right now, the US only emits 15% of the world's CO2. So things that we work on in climate change only apply to that amount. We do need to lead, and we do need to help the rest of the world. Same thing that goes with AI. We can put all the regulations on AI we want in the United States, but the rest of the world may not do so. So we need to just be aware of those. We live in a much bigger pond than just ourselves. So those are kind of the really big things that stick out to me.
Absolutely, I agree. I think that this concept of global collaboration, global frameworks when we do things is really critical. And we didn't spend a lot of time talking about that in many of our panels, but it is a good point and a good frame of reference to think about these challenges in, because these are all interconnected, really large scale challenges with a lot of diversity across the world about how we approach, how we have the resources or don't to engage in some of these sort of questions. So I appreciated that addition. George, I want to ask you one more thought here, and then I'll let our panelists, let our audience go for the day. But, one thing that kind of stuck out for me that I kept hearing, intentionally so, I think I directed our folks to talk a little bit about it, was to think about hope for the future and the things that gave them hope for the future. I know you spent a lot of time talking about and thinking about the role of hope, both for our institution, but just communities and the work that we do. Anything resonate with you that gives you hope, or as we've been talking about it too, where that provides a sense of agency?
Yeah, I definitely saw a change in tone from the previous 6 symposia around humility, listening, communicate differently, never say you're 100% sure of something, explain why your thinking has changed around this. I don't know if it's the election or the time we live in or whatever, but a lot more people use the word humbleness, much more now. That gives me a lot of hope. This idea that Marshall McLuhan was right, the media is the message. People don't change their minds because of data. They do it because of relationships and stories and conversations. And each of us can do that. And I heard that come through loud and clear as well. This idea of bringing in different perspectives, don't just talk to ourselves. The world is, even the United States is a really big place, and all of us are part of the elite. so to speak. And there are a lot of folks out there right now that would not have enjoyed this conversation or even thought to be a part of it. And we need to bring their perspectives in as well. And probably finally, as you know, I was thrilled to hear the thought that curiosity is thriving. So that's the last thing to be politicized. So that gives me as much hope as anything. If we keep people curious and asking questions, then I think we're going to do fine.
Wonderful. I heard that too, and that made me smile, even though I was off camera, which is, I completely agree. The humility that's needed from all of us, as well as just maintaining that curiosity and ways we can all do that ourselves in our lives. George, thank you so much, obviously, for kicking start this institute so many years ago and being with us every year as we host this annual symposium. Just grateful for your leadership and your support of us. I want to thank, obviously, all of our panels and speakers. Thank you to our audience for sticking with us here to the end of the day. We'll have much more to follow up with resources and videos and whatnot. And really critically, there are a few people I want to thank, which is our steering committee who helped us brainstorm and bring together some of these thoughtful people for today. Our amazing champions and supporters of the Institute who make this possible, Joni Burleson and Jim Mulligan, Alan and Logan, and Monte Kluworth. And most importantly, the Institute team who is behind the scenes, and you occasionally see him pop on the camera today because I'm having tech issues. But a huge thanks to Jordan Marks, Kate Long, Trisha Waddell, Carson Frame, and Steve Pearson for all the help in making this possible. Thank you all, everyone. Take care. Happy holidays, and wishing you a best for 2025.